Здравствуйте, and welcome to the Rushing to Conclusions podcast. We're a podcast started by Slavic immigrants who just want to share a piece of our world with the new world. We'll be talking about the Slavic youth experience in the US, so that means we'll be discussing everything from meat jelly to the challenges of taking in two cultures at once. Whatever the issue, we aim to have a conclusion, or a couple, so stick around, put on the tea kettle, and settle in as we rush off to our next conclusion.
Welcome back to part 2 of our conversation about the Slavic churches in America. So, as promised, today we have a cousin and brother joining us for the discussion. Stan has done quite a few things, from preaching to Sunday school, youth events, and a prominent member of the Slavic ministry. So, glad to have him to kind of help along in the conversation about the other half of the things that we were talking about. Stan, welcome.
Thank you. I feel welcomed.
Yes, that is the intro I was able to do on the fly. So from kind of our previous conversation, we were really talking about the history and kind of leading into the conversation of what we've experienced Slavic churches to be like in America, given our background. Let's just kind of get into it. From your experience, some of the characteristics that you've kind of seen on the ground of Slavic churches that have unique characteristics as relates to the Soviet Union. Things that would have developed in the Soviet Union that Slavic churches still retain here today, if that makes sense.
I mean, I think a lot of it is retained from before the move happened over here, and in comparison to the American churches, it's quite different, and I think we've all experienced it. And usually after an American service, you'll have questions as to why is it done that way? Because your level of exposure, you only know a certain amount of things. And to be quite honest, the church service hasn't changed much, at least from what I remember from the time living in Ukraine and attending the church there to attending the Slavic church services here. So I would say everything from preaching to the style of service to pretty much everything is still the same.
The same as it was in Ukraine, you're saying?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, what's interesting is we talked about the Soviet Union was a big part of kind of shaping that Slavic structure. There's questions after the service of why things are being done. Are you referring to like American churches or?
Yeah, if you attend an American church service, in English speaking church service, be that, whichever denomination you want to try and experience, there is going to be certain aspects of it that you're not going to understand if all you've been exposed to is the Slavic church. On the one hand, that makes sense, but then there are those questions from people that do want to experience things outside of their Slavic tradition as to why they do it a certain way versus us doing it a certain way.
I think one of the kind of big things we were talking about is during that Soviet Union time, there was a lot of need for people to be kind of into faith. Not a lot of, I guess, resources were around for like discipleship and growth and things like that. So a lot of those churches kind of worked out on emphasis on faith, but they didn't have a lot of resources for apologetics or like super engagement in culture. How does that translate into today? Like, is that something that you think we're still seeing a lack of, or?
It is, and I think a lot of the same characteristics the church had during the time of the persecution, during communism, still remain now. Because if you think about it, you had this black and white line back then where no matter what you believed, no matter what denomination you claimed to be, as long as you believed in God and you were not an atheist and were not subscribed to the Communist Party, you were persecuted. And so a lot of it was based on faith that either the Lord will come soon or you will be guided through it or anything. There wasn't time to study in seminaries, and there wasn't time for long Bible studies to take place on the daily to develop certain aspects that would be required now. And so, unfortunately, that has transitioned to our day, where you still have this emphasis on faith and works, but works-based faith, which is developed by your good works. So a lot of it is still that, where all you need to do is believe. As long as you believe, you're good to go. And just come on Sunday, experience the Sunday service, and you should be set.
Shout out to Kanye.
Yes, he's a sponsor of ours. Yeah, and maybe it's not even like intentional in some senses, where it's like, okay, we just have to, it's all works based, but you can see how it can turn into that as a result of the shift of the context in which the church is. Like the Slavic people came over here. They started Slavic churches for the most part, and they kind of found themselves at a spot where today's culture demands like we're talking about, we're engaged on terms of intellect and in terms of like emotion. A lot of these things that we're free to interact with and engage with in the culture without needing to hide. Like, Irina, you were talking about last episode about your mom getting like spied on to see if she was listening to radio or whatever.
Yep.
That's no longer the case here, but those survival instincts still are around, right? That's something they've gone through. I guess it makes sense why there wasn't a ton of groundwork laid for like robust apologetics or things like that. My mom told me a story about, she had a lot of questions when she was our age, and she went to a pastor and she started asking questions about like church history, questions about all the questions like young people have. He wasn't able to help her, not answer everything, not because like he wasn't smart or wasn't willing to. He gave her all the resources he had, but he had a couple books on his bookshelf basically, and even those he had to hide to not get jailed for having like illegal literature or whatever you call it. Those pastors that weren't hiding at the time had to be like scrutinized and screened.
So it was more of like a survival versus now we're able to actually, I don't know, not that they weren't thriving back then, but
it's what our parents' generation knows, and you cannot, I guess you can't completely blame for any shortcomings that might result because of that, because we don't know that whole world is. I guess we're kind of living in a little bit of a different world too right now. I don't know what the culture was like in the Soviet Union, like what it was like to hang out with friends or everything, but we're kind of getting understanding of that just from the different conversations we're having with our parents. So,
well, what you got to consider is that when you grow up a certain way for a long period of time, and that's all you know, you become rooted in it, and it's difficult to change that. Even when you do have this shock of moving to a different country and experiencing and having to deal with a different culture, you're still rooted in the things that you learned, and to break that would be to break yourself down, which is not always an easy thing to do or to accept. And I think we've all run into cases where, like you were saying, your mom went to a pastor because she had questions. I've spoken to other people and to older people in the Slavic community, and when you bring up things like, well, for example, in Peter, when Peter writes, right, be ready to always give an answer. The answer I got to that is you have to believe, and you would just tell them that you believe. And then when you proceed to question further, well, what does that mean? That's it. That's where it ends. And I think because that wasn't developed, unfortunately, that has continued on. And I mean, a lot of it, there's a lot of factors to that. Language barrier, I think, is one. And also consider the fact that a lot of the churches that are here, a lot of the Slavic churches are made up of people from different areas and different backgrounds. And, you have multiple different members from countries all over the Soviet Union. So it's not like they came from the same background and the same understanding of things. And so in order to make things functional, I think you had to bring things down to a more common level. at which you couldn't proceed with developing something further. And you had to bring it down to where everybody could agree on it and could survive together as a community.
Sometimes I forget that the Soviet Union wasn't just like one monolithic country or place. It involved a lot of various places. There is truly a lot of people from really different backgrounds, even though they're in the Soviet Union. I mean, it spanned from Europe to Asia, basically. What you're saying is, because of the breadth of how many people were affected by essentially the Soviet Union, were essentially had to find commonality in the faith, there wasn't a ton of resources or time to move to grow in the same direction as much as just survive with what they had.
Because you're starting off at zero.
Yeah.
In this new community with people that you don't know, and you also don't know what they've been through specifically. And so you have to find some kind of commonality, and faith became it. And you didn't ask further. You didn't have to go further because that was enough to bring people together.
Faith and persecution.
Yeah, exactly. And when you're living that way and you have a community, that provides you with an opportunity not to have to go outside of your community, which is kind of weird to say that you have an opportunity not to do something, but you have this way of living where you don't have to interact with the American culture. And I say American, I mean, the people in the United States, but
it's like a comfort thing.
Yeah, you because you're in a new country, you don't know the language, you're trying to earn for your living, and that doesn't leave much time for anything else. And so eventually you grow comfortable in that. And I think same thing goes for the church as well. When you first begin, you begin with this commonality of faith and persecution. And you become, that's what you're rooted in. And you become comfortable with it with no need to develop further because it works for you.
As a result, that persecution bit really became an identity for the older generation Slavic churches here. And on one side, it's really cool because there's a really rich heritage and really rich stories and histories of the stuff that people have gone through, the older generation has gone through. A lot to learn from. But then with what you're saying here as well, now we're set up in this culture where you do need to kind of engage on different playing fields, if that makes sense, where you and I can't really even relate as much to being persecuted as our parents can. So that's already harder to find commonality there. I mean, I know the stories, but it's different when you've lived it versus being blessed in a country where you didn't have to like hide yourself and hide what you believe. So that I feel like that also goes into within the Slavic community as well for us, that our younger generation might have a little bit of alienation from that experience. And if so much of that experience is what's based in how the church kind of goes about doing its thing, it can get harder for our generation to find a home there as well.
Yeah, and I mean, all these things just kind of formed into a perfect storm where now you're having to deal with it as this gap widens between those whose identity was living day to day being persecuted and those that weren't living in those conditions, especially for those that were born, closer to the fall of the Soviet Union or afterwards. You weren't experiencing the same levels of persecution or even any persecution. Perhaps you got made fun of once or twice, but there wasn't that threat of serious repercussions for your faith. And so it's kind of hard to leave that behind for those that grew up with that. And if you're rooted in it and your identity is that you're surviving and trying to avoid persecution while trying to remain faithful, versus your children who did not experience that gap is growing and widening. And that's why I think there's a lot of issues that come forth now, years later, that are a direct result of that.
I mean, I got made fun of, but it was not for anything related to my faith. It was because I did dumb things. Another question I had was, how does the Slavic churches today, how are they equipped to deal with cultural changes if partly they're still dealing with being persecuted mentality, which persecution is not the case in the United States? Some of the things, particularly with culture, is things that are black and white terms that maybe the issues didn't have to be faced back then, but maybe do now. For example, music or media or things like popular references that you and I would get, if we just talk about kind of what's going on in the world. How can the church, or does the Slavic church, in certain cases, able to leverage that and kind of use it as examples? Like what I'm thinking about, when Apostle Paul would quote the poet of the day or the poet of the culture when he was speaking to the Greeks, or kind of utilizing the things that were happening in the culture, and in our case, like the media and things like that aren't necessarily black or white, but that are just there, and we're trying to make sense of them. Is that a capacity that you think needs to be developed, or has it been developed yet?
I mean, I don't think it has been developed, and that's one of the areas that's mostly not there, I would say. It's because, again, we're going back to this idea that when you're still living under this mode of survival, week to week, you don't worry about things that are going on in the culture. What you're worried about is keeping your faith throughout your daily life. But yeah, that is something that definitely needs to be developed. And even, for example, let's just take what's going on in the culture now. I haven't heard anyone from a Slavic standpoint, or Slavic churches, mention anything that's going on in the culture now, with what happened starting with George Floyd and going forward to this day. That hasn't been addressed, nor I don't think it will be, because that's not something that touches us per se. I think a lot of it is just living in our own Slavic bubble. That prevents us from having to develop anything outside of that bubble.
So in your experience then, I know you've done work with youth events and things like that. What would your response or strategy be for working with a young person that's having these questions, or is kind of trying to figure out where the Slavic church would stand on certain issues? How would you guide someone like that?
See, and that's where it becomes difficult, because you don't have an underlying background of support for that. So you're on your own when it comes to that, and you have to fight for yourself. Fight is a strong word, but you have to figure things out on your own during that time, and with questions like that. And you would obviously start off at the basics, and what happened in the case with the gentleman in Minnesota, and what's been going on since is direct result of human nature, and you have to have that understanding. But that's just one example. As far as other cultural things, the difficulty is when you don't have a support level for that teaching, then you not only do you have to be able to help somebody else out, but you also have to figure it out for yourself before you can help somebody understand it also. So that's where the difficulty comes in, and that's one of the biggest, I think, shortcomings that we have in this time.
How have you seen our generation, and I guess the generation, I don't know, I use the word generation kind of loosely. I don't have like defined lines for it, but I guess, how have you seen people younger than us coming up in the Slavic church responding to being so saturated with American world and everything that's going on in our country and in our world, and trying to find support in the kind of situation you described, where there's not a ton of, for the youth workers or for the sort of young people in ministry, there's not like a huge foundation or support to deal with the questions of those younger people. What are some of the responses that you've seen, or what are some of the things in your experience you've taken note of?
Well, I mean, from a lot of it is sadly comes down to the fact that when you don't have that being addressed head on or as a preventative measure, and you that comes up, and most of the time it's just ignored altogether. You don't address it to begin with, and you don't address it during, nor do you address it afterwards. So there's really then no interest from anybody else to even ask what the perspective is of the Slavic community on it, because they get the information somewhere else already. So you don't need to figure out what's going on, because you're being told what's going on elsewhere.
I see. You're saying that it's not like the first place that the young people would go to get like takes on what's going on in the culture. They're more or less have an opinion or have an idea of how to look at things, and then that's just kind of a secondary. The elder of my Slavic church wouldn't be like the first person I as a young person would go to if we're talking about how to process, let's say some, even before all the recent events, like some big celebrity thing happened, and you can kind of tell that, oh, this is human nature at work, and we can take a lesson from this. It would be a good public example of X or Y. Like my elder at the Slavic church wouldn't be the first person I go to, because he probably wouldn't even have heard of what's going on, or he wouldn't have an opinion, or if he did, he'd just be like, "Nah, this is all bad."
Yeah, I mean, so not only that wouldn't be the first person to go to, but even if you did go to, the answer you might receive would be, unfortunately, not relevant to what's going on, just because there is that disconnect between the older Russian generation or the older Slavic generation and the culture and what's going on in the culture now. And so a lot of it is them simply not knowing, which I guess it's not blaming, but there's just, you have to understand from where everyone's coming from.
I was going to say that it kind of plays into the apologetics thing, is where we see that lacking, that kind of connects not knowing what's going on with then not being able to teach others to relate to the culture. And how would I speak to someone else who's outside of my circle about what's going on, and if I haven't been taught or I haven't been guided in the right way to respond to things?
I was reading a book, and this quote really stuck out to me, just regarding how Christians and how God spoke to people. It said God spoke to Moses in Moses' days, in Moses' ways. God spoke to Job in Job's days, in Job's ways. God spoke to David in David's days, in David's ways. And then so forth, making the point that God speaks today to us in our ways. And I think what the point that the author was trying to get at is to say there's always been a relevant message through the means of current circumstances that God would relate to people, and consequently that people would relate to other people. Older generations would be able to relate to younger generations through that. That really got me thinking about, since we are talking about kind of that teaching and apologetics deal, mentorship was another thing. Mentorship. What did mentorship look like back in the Slavic countries before the move over here? And what does that look like in a lot of the churches here now, particularly mentorship between older people and younger people? Not even in like ordained positions, but just within the church life. Older men and women and younger guys and girls. What's the relationship there?
Well, I think during the time of communism and persecution, you did not have any mentorship. You didn't have time for that, because typically your pastor or your elder would be arrested, and then it would be the next person up, and it will go through that. And so it was hard to mentor somebody when you were facing jail time on a weekly basis, and if you survived a service, you were looking forward to the next one, and you didn't know if you were going to make it through that one or not. And from what I remember, during the time that, as growing up, the limited exposure that I had, there was some sort of development going on between the elders of the church, where there was this idea of bringing with you or alongside you other brothers that you would develop, and you would show them the ropes, as you would say. Now, however, that's been lost somewhere along the way. I feel like it had a starting point, but it has gone since, and not everywhere, but a lot of the places, I don't think there is any mentorship going on.
Just thinking of that, you mentioned that before, how that language barrier plays into it today as well, because that wasn't a problem back then, but I'm thinking that's got a role to play nowadays.
Yeah, I mean, it's harder to mentor somebody when you don't share the same language, or at least the same level of language. And so you have your older generation that is proficient at speaking the Slavic languages, which are fairly together or fairly understood by everybody, be it Ukrainian or Russian or some of the other ones. There's shared commonalities there, so there's not as much between the languages coming out of the Soviet Union as there is between the Slavic languages and the English. And so you have this language barrier where you have a younger generation that's not as proficient at using the language, and even if they are, the terminologies are different now, and so the words mean different things as culture changes. So you're associating the words to what they mean now in our day, as opposed to what they meant back then, and you have this gap again forming between the old generation and the younger generation. And even if you manage to find somebody that is a proficient speaker of, let's say, Russian, there's still that gap of mentorship where the system's not developed to bring those people along. But yes, the language barrier definitely plays a role in this lack of mentorship that's going on between the older generation and the younger generation, and the baton being passed on to the next generation.
I just thinking, even though I like to think I have a decent grasp on both languages, English and Slavic languages, when I try to translate a term that I don't often use to my mom or to someone I'm speaking Russian, I often just use English translations of English words to Russian in the same order as they'd be placed in English, which wouldn't always be the case in Russian. And sometimes I end up saying something that sounds it just doesn't sound right as you're saying it. I don't know if that makes sense. It just makes for really awkward Russian phrasing. And that's just like daily conversation. But if you start to think about specifics of talking through real issues or real problems, I mean, that's an extra layer. If you're talking about something really kind of important or something that you're trying to open up about, that there's already a stress level there. But then to try to communicate clearly in the language where you feel like you're saying something, but it's being understood not the way it sounds, it can bring a lot of anxiety. And I definitely understand why oftentimes it'd be easier to just, like you said, just kind of ignore, or at the risk of some horrible miscommunication, and then someone has a horrible opinion of you, it might be tempting to just ignore.
That was my experience starting out, and so you have, I guess, from what I've seen, the mentorship starts off like this. If you are a Bible reading fella that has some ideas as to what the verses mean, and you get baptized, you are then asked to automatically start preaching in church. And that was the experience with me. 2 weeks after my baptism, a deacon, or actually an elder of the church, approached me, and he said, "Listen, so you've been baptized, so I think you should share the word." And that's how it goes for a lot of younger men in the church. There was no preparation. There was no instruction. And then on top of that, you have this language barrier. So when I started off speaking from the pulpit, I tried to do it in Russian. And so there's this, like you were saying, try having a meaningful conversation in a language that you're not 100% familiar with. And in addition to all of that, remember that growing up, we didn't speak Russian. It wasn't, we spoke a mixture of Ukrainian and Russian.
Yep.
And so now going into it, you're trying to speak Russian, a language that you never learned and that you're just trying to pick up on the fly. In addition to that, you have this responsibility of speaking from a pulpit regarding the Word of God, and you're trying to make sure that you're using terminology that is correct, not only not to offend anybody that's in the audience, but then to also, you have a higher power above you that you have to be responsible to. And so again, the mentorship that I got, I remember talking to the pastor of the church that I was at the time, and he suggested that I just go a little shorter on my sermons. He said, "Listen, 5-10 minutes, you'll be good. You're going too long."
Mini devotion.
Essentially. So that was the level of mentorship that you would receive. And I think there's a lot of that going on where you're being thrown to the wolves, and the ones that survive are the ones that get to move on to the next level, and the ones that don't kind of get to sit back down on the pews and just remain regular old church members. So yeah, the mentorship is definitely lacking. Apologetics definitely lacking. Cultural understanding, or even simple understanding of what's going on around us is also lacking. So
you're describing some real Hunger Games stuff.
Yeah.
Real.
And again, unfortunately, a lot of that is due to the fact that we've just become comfortable with our Sunday services, and there's no other effort that needs to be put in.
I'm just trying to picture you 2 weeks after being baptized, trying to be up there and communicate a message. I mean, I would ask you if you felt unprepared, but I feel like
there was a lot of stuttering and a lot of sweating. Very, very nervous, I would say.
But you at least you felt the responsibility that you had, and you didn't take it lightly.
Yeah, and so after that, I transitioned to speaking English simply because of that language barrier, where that wasn't something that I could, in Russian, explain things well enough. And so I've transitioned into that, and a lot of the times you do get this pushback of, well, we don't understand. But what I find is that majority of the church members now, if they're of a middle age group, let's say, they have a level of understanding of English that they don't want to either say that they do, or I'm not sure even how to describe it. It's they'll tell you they don't understand, but you know that they understand perfectly fine. And so that's what I found, is that you do, after I speak, sometimes you'll get one or two people come up to you and say, "Listen, you can't do it in Russian. Like it's hard for us to sit there and not understand anything." But I find that the majority of people do understand. So there is that language barrier is being broken down as far as communication goes, from the pulpit, should you choose to speak in English, to the rest of the members. But there's still this barrier or gap between the elders, I would say, the older generation, and the younger men and women.
One of the things I was also just thinking about now is, so we went to a Slavic conference, and I remember having this really cool impression, because so after there's a lot of talks about, just like different breakout session and topics, and I was kind of just like tired after that, and we were having lunch, and I was like, ugh, I want to eat, I just want to get away from everything. And we were eating lunch, and we were kind of talking with people from some other state, or like people mingling around, and I was really impressed that like I heard a lot of conversations that were still talking about the topics that were being talked about during the sessions, and like what people's opinions were, if people agreed or disagreed, or if people were, what they thought about that. It just kind of struck me, because I wasn't in that headspace or whatever. I wasn't trying to talk to anyone about anything. I was just trying to go outside or eat. I was really impressed that people cared. Like young people genuinely still cared about those topics, even though maybe they didn't understand everything during the session. Maybe I didn't understand everything that was said. I don't know what's responsible for that, if there's any intentional effect of that, but it was really encouraging to see it. I was like, wow, people, they're still super interested about the topics that are being talked about. I was just hungry. I was just starving. And my experience is not vast, but I really had the impression that if you took 600 Slavic youth and 600 American youth, and compared the two samples to be interested in spiritual things, I really do have the feeling that the 600 Slavic people, there'd be a bigger proportion of youth interested in spiritual things than American youth. Not because American youth is horrible or anything like that, and not that my statistic is really based on any legitimate research or anything like that. I'm just talking about my impression and what it seems to be like, that there's still a lot of kids who care about that because they were raised in a household where maybe they didn't get the answer for every question they had, but they were definitely instilled with such a, God-fearing mentality, at least, or at least a strong sense of right and wrong, at least, where they're not apathetic, I guess. If that makes any sense. I don't know if you guys have observed the same thing, or kind of if that's making sense what I'm saying.
Yeah, I mean, I would totally agree, and a lot of it is everyone has, I would say, a common goal in mind. The older generation, the younger generation. It's just a matter of the younger generation trying to fit into this culture that was developed, through years and through different experiences that they didn't necessarily go through, and they're just trying to find their place. And I think that's and still kind of my situation that I'm in. Is trying to be a productive member while trying to also fit in, because my views are not necessarily the same as those of the older people in the church. But that doesn't mean that, I'm not interested in being part of it, or being part of the culture, or wanting to leave it. And I think there's a lot of that going around. It's just a matter of finding the commonalities in which we can work together towards, and be productive in that.
Can I get an amen? Because, yeah, I mean, that's exactly right, though. That was well said. So, leads me to my next question. It's not really a question, though. More of a conclusion type situation. What, in your thoughts, you think would be a good strategy for immigrant churches, specifically the Slavic churches, to form a new identity? Or do they really need a new identity, or just be more open to adapting and flowing with the culture? Because I'll just kind of explain my thinking around this question. I know that certain people want to. There's always people who just want to either retain everything that they had back in the time, or certain people just want everything new and just go off and wipe the slate clean, if you will. And I feel like the truth is somewhere in the middle. I mean, just even thinking about kind of like what the Apostle Paul talked about, being constantly adapting, but not in a way that's disconnecting from the message of where you came from, being a Gentile to the Gentile, a Jews to the Jews, and all things like that. What do you think that looks like, or some practical ways you guys think that can look like through the efforts of people, of the Slavic churches in America?
Well, I think looking at it from the previous experience of other immigrants, right, you won't find many churches that are of people that have moved here previously. For example, there's a large, at least from what I'm being told, there's a large German community, or was a large German community with German churches that existed here in the place where I live previously. Those are no longer around. And so the Russian church, I think, is facing the same thing. And because of the disconnects that there are, and the lack of, I think, understanding on both sides towards the other side, and you have the younger generation that has questions that are not being answered, and that are looking for things, and looking to grow in things further, and they have more exposure to the outside world, if you would. There's a tendency for them to give up kind of on their community and to go and seek those answers elsewhere. And so I think the Russian church is certainly facing that as well, where as the older generation passes on and the younger generation remains, that it will eventually, the Russian church, or the Slavic church as we know it today, would disappear here. And I think in order for the churches to continue, there has to be more there than just the language commonality and this idea that was brought over of we have faith and we are the persecuted people. There needs to be more there than that. And I think a lot of it is, and there's been examples of this already, where churches have returned to the basics, because again, you have this disconnect between what's going on in the minds of the younger generation and in the minds of the old generation, where whenever you mention anything or suggest changing something, the old generation feels like it's a personal attack on them. Not only that, then you have this idea of like, okay, well, if American churches are so great, well, like, are you gonna go there? And you have this divide that develops between our culture and our tradition, our church. This is how we do it, and then everybody else out in the world, and all the American churches. And I think there's a little bit of a disconnect there, and that's a thing that causes issues, is because the church should be the church. It's not based on a language or a culture or anything like that. Sure, those things play a factor, but I think a return kind of to the basics is needed. A return to Scripture. And a lot of that, what also is missing is kind of the historical aspect from the Russian church, where we don't really know the history, and it's not being taught. And so when you don't include the history of the Western church, all you are left with is this very small footprint. And so you don't really have a solid foundation to stand on of the men and women that came before you. And so that causes issues also, because you have one side saying one thing, another side saying a different thing, but there's no common ground on which you can stand.
Yeah, the historical aspect, I think, is a really interesting and unique thing too, because I mean, for myself, and I grew up mostly in an American community, I didn't really even start grasping getting into church history till later on in like my college years. There's just a lot to be learned there, and the commonality that's possible, I think, is really encouraging. When you think about American church versus Russian church, or versus maybe another culture church, does unity have to mean uniformity is my question. Do you think there's room for retaining different practices and still being considered unified in terms of within the Russian churches individually and American churches? Like, I really like certain things that Slavic churches do that's kind of just unique to Slavic churches.
Oh yeah, for sure. I think that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to just transition into, what the churches here in America are doing and have been doing. It doesn't mean that you have to change the way you do services or all of it, and it doesn't mean you have to completely get rid of the things that you have learned, the things that you have experienced, the things that you have stood on. But I think there needs to be an expansion of ideas and kind of expanding the universe of your understanding, because right now it's kind of limited to, well, this is what we have lived through and that's it. So I think there has to be a conversation that takes place, an open conversation, an honest conversation about, that there are other aspects and there are other historical records that have taken place that we can learn from and we can build on.
So church history, mentorship, basics meaning the mere Christianity aspect of Christianity, I guess. Are we missing anything? What about evangelism or reaching out into the community type of deal?
Yeah, and I think that's where the language barrier plays the biggest part, is when you have a fully Russian service, it's hard to bring in people from the outside that are of different language. So I think that's also something that the Slavic church is at a crossroads on, is because in order to continue on and to survive, we cannot solely rely on growing from within. And I think evangelism has been lacking because of that exact barrier, where the language is different. And so I think that's another thing that needs to be addressed, and that does take time, but I think it does need to be discussed, and ideas have to be brought forth as to how we can be inclusive to both and perhaps eventually transition to the language that's going to be common for the generations to come.
Sure. And so we're kind of talking right now broad sweeping ideas as well as more specific things too. So the second conclusion question, I guess I'll just throw out to everyone. What type of things can get the older generations and the younger generations within the Slavic church kind of back on the same page, or at least in mutual understanding? What's you guys' conclusions?
I mean, I think the biggest thing is communication, which is lacking, because again, multiple factors. You have different terminology being used. You have different languages spoken, but it needs to take place and needs to be an honest conversation, and one where you are considerate of the other side and not just pushing through your ideas. And then I think that goes to both sides, because oftentimes we just want to stand on our points and we don't want to move, and we don't want to take into consideration what others have gone through or what others are experiencing. And the younger people tend to say that that's it's not them, it's the older generation that's that way, that are stubborn. But I find myself and others that at times, yes, that also applies to me as well.
Yeah, I think having grace for our older generation is really important, and to, I guess, have a objective view of yourself is hard, but I think that's the necessary thing for both sides.
Or at least being willing to be critiqued. Because perfect objectivity is oh boy. If only.
I think you have to go into it willing to give something up, willing to change for the greater good, rather than sticking to your guns, and then you end up with a place that's divided or broken.
Yeah, that's a selfless view of growth, right? A selfless view of change. Like you just said, change for the greater good, which that implies the well-being of other people as a consideration rather than just what's comfortable to you.
I think another thing might be just, I think this could apply to any, I mean, even churches here in America, not just Slavic churches, but maybe I guess Western Christianity in general is just the basic, like we already kind of talked about going back to basics, but kind of having basic theological teaching and kind of revisiting those things, because that's the foundation that, you know, churches are supposed to be built upon. And I think that's one thing that I know the younger generation definitely needs in the Slavic church, but maybe even the older generation, just to revisit those things. And I think that's a crucial part of people getting on the same page. I don't know exactly how that would play out. There's a lot of factors, but I think that's one important thing.
I think with basics will come coherency in the messaging and in the way things are structured, which will again put everybody on a same page in the book, if you would, where from there you can begin to build up, as opposed to being divided on deeper quote unquote topics, which do not allow for work to proceed, and people tend to just stick to what they know there. So,
and you know what, part of my conclusion, I guess, is let's look to and acknowledge all the positive things that are happening as well. A number of Slavic churches I've done research on that are doing a fairly good job of incorporating both English and Russian teaching and being mindful of both the cultures, seeing a lot of resources online and blogs and things like that younger people can get a hold of and be involved in or interact with. At least just having those things to interact with at least means more than nothing. Even if you don't perfectly agree with something, or if you don't have to eat everything up, but at least engage in critical thinking, give it the opportunity to, is huge. And I've seen some churches, Slavic churches, but have an English service too, or at least articles in English about current topics and current events, and have a big youth group, or those churches have a youth presence, at least, is what I'm saying. That's kind of in that same position. That's super valuable, and we can learn from those churches and grow in that direction. So I guess my conclusion would be to find those positives, find the places that are doing it right, that are working correctly, and learn from them. Acknowledge the negatives, but don't dwell in them.
Yeah, you kind of have to take a look at where you are and what you have and go from there. And do, kind of, what do we do now with what we have? It's kind of a question I think both sides have to ask. And just move forward.
I think just like with anything, there's definitely positives there, but there's definitely things that we do need to work on. But it's something that I think we're being brought through and we're growing from, and it's just a matter of staying patient with it and trusting God to walk us through this process. And it's not the easiest thing always, and it is frustrating at times. But I think there is a lot of good that can come from it. And so the giving up is really not an option, I think. And I think you just need to keep pushing through it, and eventually we'll have something that's pretty good, and we can all recognize as being something that we work towards and something that we have accomplished together.
Well said.
I think we covered a lot, and you guys shared a lot of wisdom.
Stan, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for taking time out of your robust day, whatever has been going on.
Thanks for talking to me, and thank you for the opportunity to share my perspective on things. Again, it's just my perspective, and it doesn't necessarily guarantee that everybody has had the same experience, but
thank you. Any big plans for the rest of the day?
Well, nap time.
Понятно. Well, as we like to do, we like to conclude by thanking everyone for joining us. And if you've listened this far, you truly are amazing.
Shout out to the people who listened through our whole episode last time. We appreciate the support and love. Let us know what you think about this topic, and if you have any experiences to share, we'd love to hear them.
We'll see you next time.
Ciao.
Oh shoot, I didn't hit record. Oh shoot, I didn't hit record.